I never saw it coming. I guess no one ever does, though, right? You think everything's fine, that your life is on track, that your marriage is solid. But then, out of nowhere, your whole world flips upside down. My name's Jesse, and I thought I had it all figured out. A stable job, a decent house, and most importantly, a wife I loved. Her name was Emily. We'd been together for nearly 10 years. She was my everything. But maybe that was the problem. Looking back, there were signs, little things I brushed off, thinking they were just part of the ups and downs of marriage. We'd been busy lately, both of us focused on work and just trying to keep up with life. I didn't think too much of it when she stayed out late with friends or when she seemed a bit more distant. But now, when I piece it together, it feels so obvious. It started with subtle changes. Emily's laugh didn't sound the same when we were together. She wasn't looking at me the way she used to. I remember trying to initiate a conversation one night, just something simple like, "How was your day?" But she brushed me off, said she was too tired to talk. She went straight to bed without so much as a glance in my direction. That was the first time I felt something was really off. But even then, I told myself it was just a rough patch. All couples go through them, right? Brad was the kind of friend everyone envied. Confident, successful, and always cracking jokes. We'd been close since college, the type of guys who could go months without talking but pick up right where we left off. Brad had been through some rough patches with relationships, but he always came out on top, or so it seemed. He wasn't the type of guy you'd think would be the center of my problems, at least not back then. Emily and Brad got along well. They always had. At first, I liked that my best friend and my wife got along so easily. We'd hang out together, have drinks, and share stories. Seemed normal. After all, you want your spouse to get along with your friends, right? But then things started feeling different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. Just a gut feeling, something gnawing at me in the background. One Saturday, Brad came over to watch the game. Emily was out shopping with her sister, or at least that's what she said. We sat on the couch, cracked open a few beers, and I thought maybe this would be a chance to relax. But my mind was elsewhere. Brad was his usual self, joking around, making comments about the players on TV. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. She'd been so distant lately, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Everything good, man?" Brad asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. "You seem off." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He shrugged and took another swig of his beer. "Marriage stress? I get it. Relationships can be a real pain sometimes." I nodded, not really in the mood to dive into my worries. But Brad wasn't one to drop a subject easily. "You and Emily seem solid though," he said. "I wouldn't stress too much. Just the usual ups and downs, right?" "Yeah, sure," I muttered, trying to convince myself more than him. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, Emily came home late, bags in hand, smiling as if everything was normal. I wanted to ask her where she'd really been, why she hadn't texted me all day, but I didn't. Instead, I just helped her put away the groceries she'd bought and pretended like everything was fine. We went to bed in silence, the distance between us growing wider with every passing day. A few weeks went by, and things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Emily was staying out later, and her excuses were becoming harder to believe. She'd tell me she was working late or meeting up with friends, but I never saw any of these friends, and her work schedule hadn't changed. One night, she came home after midnight, smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. I didn't say anything, just turned over in bed and closed my eyes, hoping sleep would take away the anxiety gnawing at my insides. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was going on, and I needed answers. But confronting Emily didn't feel right. Not yet. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started keeping an eye on her, checking her phone when she left it unattended, glancing at her messages when they popped up. I felt guilty about it, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't let me stop. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for, or rather what I was afraid of. A string of texts between Emily and a number I didn't recognize. At first, it seemed innocent enough. But then I noticed how she smiled when those messages came through. how she was quick to hide her phone whenever I walked into the room. The messages got more frequent, and her behavior more distant. The final straw came one evening when she told me she was going to a work event. She left the house dressed up nicer than I'd seen her in months. I didn't say a word, just watched her walk out the door, my mind racing with possibilities. And then, just like that, she was gone for the night. I was done playing the fool. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. That night, as Emily disappeared into the night without so much as a backward glance, I felt an unfamiliar anger bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just the suspicion anymore. It was the realization that I had been avoiding the truth. Something was happening behind my back, and I was too much of a coward to confront it head-on. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, replaying every odd moment from the past few months. Every lie, every deflection, every moment when Emily had chosen her phone over me. My mind kept circling back to the texts, the late nights, the sudden changes. It wasn't like her, at least not the version of her I thought I knew. But maybe I hadn't known her as well as I thought. Brad. His name popped into my head, uninvited, like a stubborn weed pushing through the cracks of my sanity. He'd always been there, always so close to us. Maybe too close. I hated myself for even thinking it, but something about the way he'd been acting recently gnawed at me. His comments, the way he'd assured me that everything was normal between Emily and me, felt off now. Too convenient. Too rehearsed. I grabbed my phone and opened my messages. There was Brad's name near the top of my list. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether I should text him, ask if he knew what was going on. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. If there was something between Emily and Brad, I didn't want to find out through a phone screen. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd have the guts to do. I followed her. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and left the house. I didn't have a plan, just a vague idea of where she might be going. She'd mentioned the work event, but I knew better. Emily had become too good at lying. I needed to see for myself where she really was. I drove through the night, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough that my knuckles turned white. I wasn't far behind her, and my heart raced as I spotted her car parked outside a fancy downtown hotel. My chest tightened. She'd never mentioned anything about a hotel. What the hell was she doing here? I parked a few spots away, watching as Emily stepped out of the car. She looked different. Her makeup was done in a way she hadn't bothered with for months. Her dress clung to her figure in a way that sent a sick feeling rolling through my stomach. This wasn't Emily heading to some work event. This was Emily on a date. I stayed in my car for a few minutes, unsure of what to do next. Should I confront her right there? Make a scene? Or should I follow her inside, try to catch her in the act? My mind raced through all the possibilities, but none of them felt right. I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth, whatever it was. After what felt like an eternity, I made up my mind. I got out of the car and followed her inside. The hotel lobby was quiet, almost too quiet for a Friday night. I kept my distance, watching as Emily walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I trailed behind her, staying far enough away that she wouldn't notice me. She stepped into the elevator, and I held my breath. I couldn't do it. I couldn't follow her up there, but I needed to know who she was meeting. Just as the elevator doors were about to close, I caught a glimpse of someone walking toward her. Brad. Felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. There he was, my best friend, strolling casually toward the elevator as if this was all perfectly normal. Emily smiled when she saw him, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He stepped inside, and the doors slid shut. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing a million miles a minute. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? I felt like the biggest fool in the world, standing there like a statue while my wife and my best friend disappeared upstairs together. I stumbled back outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I tried to process what I'd just seen. Emily and Brad, together, in a hotel. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. For the next few hours, I sat in my car, staring blankly at the hotel, replaying everything over and over in my head. How long had they been sneaking around like this? Had I been blind or just stupid? Every joke Brad had made, every time Emily had brushed me off, it all felt like a cruel setup. Eventually, I drove home, but I barely remember the drive. I was too consumed by anger, confusion, and heartbreak. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the weight of everything was crushing me. I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. I needed the truth. When Emily finally came home, she didn't look surprised to see me still awake. If anything, she looked calm. Too calm. She kicked off her heels and set her purse down on the counter, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before she looked away. "How was the work event?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel the rage boiling just beneath the surface. She hesitated for a second, her face flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "It was fine," she said, her voice too smooth, too rehearsed. A bit boring, honestly. I clenched my fists, feeling the urge to scream building inside me. I couldn't stand the lies anymore, but I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wasn't ready to confront her, not until I had all the pieces. For now, I would wait. The days that followed felt like living in some twisted version of reality. I couldn't unsee the image of Brad and Emily disappearing together into that elevator. Every smile she gave me, every kiss she pressed to my cheek felt like a performance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was nothing but an audience member in this staged life we were living. Couldn't sleep. Every night, my mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had they been doing this for months? Was it just physical, or was there more to it? I started to question every conversation I'd had with both of them, scrutinizing every word, every glance, every inside joke. How had I missed this? The worst part was, I couldn't say anything to anyone. I didn't want to be the guy whose wife was cheating on him with his best friend. So, I swallowed my pride, kept quiet, and carried on like everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, I grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I needed proof, something solid that would confirm what I already knew in my gut. My hands shook as I swiped up, unlocking her phone with ease. I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding with every swipe. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Texts to coworkers, her mom, a few friends. I was starting to think maybe I was wrong when I found it. A message thread with Brad. There it was, in plain sight, and my stomach dropped. Their conversation wasn't overtly romantic or incriminating, but there were little things, small comments that had a different meaning now that I knew what I'd seen. A dinner they'd planned together, little jokes that were clearly inside references, and then one text that stopped me in my tracks. "I'll see you Friday night. Same place. Friday night." That was the night she'd gone to the work event. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. My pulse quickened as I realized what that meant. Brad and Emily had their little meetups right under my nose, and it was happening again soon. I felt sick. My world was unraveling, and all I could do was stand there, phone in hand, like some pathetic detective in my own marriage. I wanted to smash the phone, wake her up, and scream at her for betraying me. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to see it to catch them red-handed. I needed them to know that I knew. That Friday night, I told Emily I had to work late. She barely reacted, which only fueled my suspicions further. I'd been working late more often these days, staying out of the house as much as I could to avoid the tension that seemed to thicken every time we were in the same room together. But this time, I had a plan. I parked outside the hotel where I'd seen them before, my fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. It was like something out of a nightmare, waiting for your worst fear to play out in real time. I didn't have to wait long. A few minutes after I arrived, I saw Emily's car pull into the lot. She stepped out, dressed up again, looking like she was heading to some fancy dinner. My chest tightened, the betrayal hitting me all over again. How could she stand there, looking so calm, like this was all perfectly normal? And then, just like before, Brad arrived. I watched, seething in silence, as they exchanged a few words outside the hotel. There was no kiss, no dramatic embrace. But it was enough. The way they stood together, close enough to touch, their smiles too familiar, too comfortable. It told me everything I needed to know. I followed them inside again, my heart pounding in my ears as they headed for the elevator. This time, I didn't stay behind. Couldn't. I had to know, had to see how far this went. I slipped into the elevator just before the doors closed, standing in the back as they stood oblivious to my presence. They were chatting casually, as if this was just another Friday night. Brad mentioned something about a work project, and Emily laughed. It was a sound that used to make me feel warm inside. Now it made my skin crawl. The elevator dinged, and they stepped out together, heading down the hallway. I stayed far enough behind that they wouldn't notice me, my stomach churning with every step I took. They stopped in front of a door, and Brad pulled out a key card. He slid it into the lock, and the door clicked open. Emily stepped inside, and Brad followed, the door closing softly behind them. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity. My hands trembled, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to do. Kick the door down, drag Brad out by his collar, scream at Emily until my throat was raw. But I did none of those things. I was paralyzed, frozen by the weight of what I'd just seen. I turned and walked away, my vision blurring as I stumbled back to the elevator. I couldn't face them. Not like this. Not yet. I needed time to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Back in my car, I sat in silence, staring at the hotel, my mind blank. The anger I'd been feeling for days, weeks, even months. It wasn't enough to make sense of this. My wife, the woman I'd loved for years, was in that room with my best friend. And I had no idea what to do next. I could confront them. I could blow up my entire life in one fiery explosion of truth. But then what? Would that really fix anything? Would it make me feel any better? Or would it just leave me picking up the pieces of a life that had already shattered? As I drove home that night, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. I spent the weekend in a haze, barely able to function. Every time Emily spoke to me, it was like listening to someone through a fog. Her words bounced off me, meaningless and hollow. She smiled, laughed, went about her business as if nothing had changed. Like she wasn't sneaking around behind my back with Brad. I don't know how she could do it. How could she lie so easily? How could she look me in the eyes and pretend like everything was fine? I kept waiting for her to slip up, to give me a sign that she knew I was onto her. But nothing. She was so casual, so composed. It made me sick. I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone I didn't know anymore. That Sunday night, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't live like this, silent, watching them carry on as if I didn't exist. I needed to confront her, to put an end to the charade. But I wasn't ready to explode. I had to be strategic, get her to admit to it, catch her in her own lie. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when I walked into the living room. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm. Casual. Hey, Eminencia, can we talk? She looked up, smiling like nothing was wrong. Sure, what's up? I sat down next to her, forcing myself to stay steady. It's just, I've been thinking about us, about how things have been lately. Her smile faded slightly, and she set her phone down. What do you mean? I don't know. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. It just feels like we've been distant, like we're not connecting the way we used to. She furrowed her brow, her expression softening. Jesse, I didn't realize you felt that way. I thought things were fine. I bit the inside of my cheek, trying to keep my emotions in check. Well, I guess I've been feeling like maybe there's something going on that we're not talking about. Her eyes flickered for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. But she recovered quickly, giving me a confused look. What are you talking about? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I saw you, Emily, at the hotel, with Brad. Her face went pale. For the first time in days, I saw her composure crack. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she just stared at me, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in headlights. I followed you, I continued, keeping my voice steady. I saw you go in together. I know what's been going on. She blinked, her mouth finally working as she sputtered. Jesse, it's not what you think. I swear. It's not what it looks like. I laughed bitterly. Not what I think. Emily, I watched you walk into a hotel with my best friend. How am I supposed to take that? Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, panicking. It's not an affair, Jesse. I swear to God. It's not like that. I wanted to believe her. Part of me was desperate for her to say something, anything, that would explain all of this in a way that didn't end with her and Brad betraying me. But I'd seen too much. I wasn't going to let her off that easily. Then what is it, huh? I asked, my voice rising. What have you two been doing? Sneaking around behind my back? Meeting up at hotels? She wiped at her eyes, her hands shaking. We weren't sneaking around. We were working on something. It's personal, Jesse. But I swear it's not what you think. Personal? I scoffed. You expect me to believe that? She nodded frantically. Yes, it's not about us, it's about Brad. He's been going through something. And I was helping him. That's all. I didn't want to tell you because he asked me not to. I stared at her, my mind spinning. It was a good lie if it was a lie. The way she said it, the way her voice wavered, almost made me believe her. Almost. What could Brad possibly be going through that he couldn't tell me? I asked, narrowing my eyes. What's so personal that he needed you to help him, but not me? Emily hesitated for a moment, biting her lip. It's about his marriage. He and Michelle have been having problems, and he didn't want you to know. He was embarrassed. That stopped me in my tracks. Michelle? Brad and Michelle had been married for years. I'd always thought they were solid, no major issues. But if what Emily was saying was true, I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. So you've been meeting up with Brad to, what? Counsel him? Talk about his marriage? She nodded, her tears spilling over again. Yes, that's all it is. He didn't want you to know because he felt like it would change your friendship. He's been struggling, Jesse. I was just trying to help. I wanted to believe her so badly. I wanted to grab onto that explanation and cling to it, to let it be the truth so that I didn't have to face the alternative. But there was still something nagging at me, something that didn't add up. Why the hotel? I asked quietly. Why meet up at a hotel, Emily? She sniffed, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater. Because it's neutral. It's private. We didn't want to run into anyone we knew, especially you. We were trying to be discreet. Not because we were doing anything wrong, but because Brad was afraid it would get back to you or Michelle. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing the air out of my lungs. It was such a simple answer, so perfectly reasonable. And yet, it felt like there was still something lurking beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling me. I sat back on the couch, running a hand through my hair. I don't know, Emily. I don't know if I can believe you. She reached out, grabbing my hand, her voice desperate. Please, Jesse. I swear, I'm not lying to you. I've never cheated on you, and I never would. This is all about Brad and his problems. That's all. I looked down at her hand on mine, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The trust I'd had in her, in our relationship, had been shattered. And now I didn't know what to believe. But for now, I didn't have any proof that she was lying. All I had were my suspicions, and I wasn't sure if that was enough to blow up my marriage. I need some time, I said quietly, pulling my hand away. I need to think. She nodded, her face crumpling with relief. Take all the time you need. I'm here, and I'll tell you everything you want to know. I promise. I stood up, feeling like I was in a daze. I didn't know what to do, where to go from here. All I knew was that things couldn't go back to the way they were. As I walked out of the room, Emily's voice followed me. I love you, Jesse. Please believe me. But as much as I wanted to, I wasn't sure if I could. I didn't sleep much that night. Emily's words kept spinning in my head, looping over and over again. Her story was so perfectly crafted, so well rehearsed, that part of me couldn't help but doubt it. But the other part of me, The part that loved her, that still wanted to believe in us, was clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. It was hell trying to balance those two conflicting feelings. On the one hand, I was hurt, angry, and betrayed. I had seen the signs, followed her to that hotel, and witnessed something that no man ever wants to see. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of my mind. What if Emily really was just helping Brad? What if I jumped to the wrong conclusion? I decided to take a few days off work. I told my boss I needed time to clear my head, but in reality, I just needed to distance myself from everything. From Emily, from Brad, from the entire situation. I needed space to think. For the first time in years, I stayed at a hotel alone. Not one of the swanky places like the one Emily and Brad had gone to, but a modest place near the edge of town. I needed solitude, away from any reminders of my life with Emily. But even in that solitude, I couldn't escape the memories. I thought about the good times Emily and I had shared, how perfect things used to be. The trips we'd taken, the late-night conversations, the laughter. The thought of it all being tainted by this situation was almost unbearable. I found myself scrolling through old photos of us on my phone, searching for some kind of clue, something that might explain how we'd ended up here. But all I saw were two people who looked happy, in love. There were no signs of anything wrong. How could everything have fallen apart so quickly? After a couple of days, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the issue. I had to figure out what was really going on with Brad and Emily. If her story was true, I needed to know. If she was lying, I needed proof. That's when I made a decision. I would confront Brad. I'd stayed silent long enough, and I couldn't let this fester any longer. I needed to hear his side of the story, to look him in the eye and see if he would tell me the same thing Emily had. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't keep running from it. I called Brad that afternoon, keeping my voice casual.
Hey, man.
You got a minute to meet up? I've been wanting to catch up. He hesitated for a second, and I wondered if he knew what was coming. But then he agreed. Sure, Jesse. Let's grab a drink later. How about that bar on 4th? I agreed, my stomach twisting with anxiety. This was it, the moment where everything would either come crashing down or I'd finally get some answers. When I arrived at the bar, Brad was already sitting at a table, nursing a beer. He looked up and smiled when he saw me, but there was something off about his expression. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made me uneasy. I sat down, ordering a drink for myself, and we made small talk for a few minutes. It felt forced, awkward, like we were both avoiding the elephant in the room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided to just rip off the Band-Aid. Brad, I began, my voice steady. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He frowned slightly, taking a sip of his beer. Sure, man. What's up? I leaned in, my eyes locking onto his. Are you and Emily having an affair? His reaction was immediate. He almost choked on his drink, coughing as he set the glass down. His eyes widened, and he looked genuinely shocked. What?
Jesse, no.
What are you talking about? I didn't flinch. I had to stay firm, no matter how much I wanted to believe his denial. I saw you two at the hotel. I followed you there. So don't lie to me, Brad. Just tell me the truth. He blinked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Jesse, I swear, we're not having an affair. It's nothing like that. I clenched my jaw, my frustration boiling over. Then what the hell is going on? Why have you two been sneaking around behind my back? Emily says it's about your marriage, that you didn't want me to know. Is that true? Brad's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Look, Jesse.
I'm sorry.
I should have told you what was going on, but I was embarrassed. I didn't want you to see me like that. Like what? I asked, my voice laced with skepticism. He sighed, staring down at the table. Michelle and we've been having problems. It's been bad for a while, but I didn't know how to talk to anyone about it. Emily noticed something was off, and she reached out to me. We started talking, and I opened up to her about everything. But I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to think less of me. His words mirrored what Emily had told me, almost word for word. Felt rehearsed, like they'd coordinated their stories. But at the same time, Brad looked genuinely upset, like he was ashamed of himself for hiding this from me. I wasn't sneaking around with her, Brad continued, his voice earnest. She was just trying to help. That's all it was. I swear, Jesse, I would never do that to you. You're my best friend. I stared at him, trying to read his face, his body language. There was no trace of guilt, no sign that he was hiding anything. He looked like a man who was genuinely struggling, and it made me pause. Could I have been wrong? I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I don't know what to think anymore, Brad. I don't know if I can trust either of you right now. He leaned forward, his eyes filled with sincerity. I get it, man. I don't blame you for being suspicious. But I promise you nothing happened. I would never betray you like that. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Brad and Emily had only been trying to help each other through tough times. But after everything I'd seen, I wasn't sure if I could just take their word for it. I need time, I muttered, standing up. I need to think about all this. Brad nodded, standing up as well. Take as much time as you need, Jesse. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. I walked out of the bar, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I didn't know who to believe anymore. Emily, Brad, or even myself. All I knew was that my world had been turned upside down, and I wasn't sure if it would ever go back to the way it was. As I drove away from the bar, I realized I was no closer to the truth than before. Brad had said all the right things, and so had Emily. If they were telling the truth, then maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. But there was still that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, that tiny voice whispering, something's not right. I went back to the hotel, trying to gather my thoughts. I'd always prided myself on being a logical guy, someone who didn't act on emotion alone. But now, every rational thought was tangled up in my emotions. I wanted to trust Emily, to trust Brad. But after what I had seen, could I? The next day, I decided to return home. Avoiding Emily wasn't going to solve anything, and I needed to face whatever this was head-on. When I walked through the front door, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy like she had been crying. She looked up at me with a mixture of relief and fear. "Jesse, I'm so glad you're back," she said softly. "I've been a wreck since you left. I was so scared I'd lost you." I sat down across from her, the tension between us almost suffocating. "I'm here, but we need to talk." She nodded, biting her lower lip. "I know. I understand. Look," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I talked to Brad. He told me the same story you did, about his problems with Michelle, how you were just helping him. But I need to know, is that really all there is?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to grab my hand. "I swear to you, Jesse, that's all it was. I never slept with Brad. I would never do that to you. He's just a friend who needed someone to talk to. I know it looks bad, and I know I should have told you about it sooner, but I didn't want to worry you." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. She looked so sincere, so desperate for me to believe her, and part of me wanted to more than anything, but that doubt still lingered. "I want to believe you, Emily," I said, my voice cracking, "but I don't know if I can. Not after everything I've seen." She squeezed my hand, her grip tight and pleading. "Please, Jesse, please believe me. I love you. You're my husband, my best friend. I would never hurt you like that." I stared into her eyes, searching for any hint of deception. But all I saw was a woman who was hurting, a woman who seemed to genuinely love me. Maybe I had been wrong all along. Maybe I had let my fears cloud my judgment. "I need time," I said finally, pulling my hand away. "I need time to figure this all out." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I understand. Just don't give up on us, Jesse. Please." I left the house again, not because I wanted to run away, but because I needed space to think. I drove aimlessly for a while, my mind racing. Every part of me was at war. One side telling me to believe her, to forgive her, and the other side screaming that something wasn't right. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Brad. "Jesse, I need to talk to you. There's something you need to know." My heart skipped a beat. What could Brad possibly want to tell me now? My hands trembled as I texted him back, agreeing to meet. He asked me to come over to his place that evening. When I arrived at Brad's house, he opened the door looking more disheveled than I had ever seen him. He motioned for me to come inside, his face drawn and serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Brad began, his voice low, "and there's something I didn't tell you yesterday." My stomach churned. This was it. Either I was about to hear a confession, or I was going to be dragged further into this nightmare. "I wasn't completely honest with you," Brad admitted, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "I wasn't lying about my problems with Michelle, but there's more to it, and you deserve to know." I stood there, frozen, waiting for him to continue. "Jesse," he said, his eyes filled with guilt. "Emily and I, we kissed. It only happened once, and it was a mistake. I swear nothing else happened. But I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to make things worse."
I'm sorry.
His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was saying. They had kissed. They had crossed a line, even if it was just a kiss. It wasn't an affair, but it was still a betrayal. And they had both lied to me about it. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "When did this happen?" I demanded. Brad looked down at the floor, shame written all over his face. "About a month ago. We were talking and things just got out of hand. But I swear, Jesse, it didn't go any further. After that, we both knew it was a mistake, and we promised not to let it happen again." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A month ago? That was right around the time I had started noticing the changes in Emily. The late-night texts, the distance between us, it all made sense now. "You should have told me," I said through gritted teeth. "Both of you should have told me." Brad nodded, his face pale. "I know, and I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this far." I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of his house, my mind a storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, hurt, but most of all, I felt a deep sense of loss. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She could tell by the look on my face that I knew. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, tears welling up in her eyes. "You kissed him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily broke down, sobbing uncontrollably.
I'm sorry, Jesse.
"I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I love you, not him. Please believe me." But I couldn't. Not anymore. I walked past her, into our bedroom and packed a bag. Emily followed me, pleading for forgiveness, but I was numb to it all. I needed space, time to figure out if our marriage could survive this, or if I even wanted it to. As I closed the door behind me, leaving Emily alone in our home, I realized that the trust we had built over the years had been shattered, and I didn't know if we could ever put the pieces back together. I threw my bag into the trunk and got behind the wheel, slamming the door shut. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Everything I thought I knew about Emily, about us, had been completely upended. It wasn't a full-blown affair, but it didn't matter. That kiss had unraveled the entire fabric of our marriage. I sat there for a long moment, my heart racing, my mind buzzing with anger and confusion. Where was I supposed to go now? What was I supposed to do? Part of me wanted to scream, to lash out at the unfairness of it all. But another part of me was exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of betrayal. After what felt like an eternity, I started the car and pulled out of the driveway. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe a hotel, maybe just anywhere but there. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in the house where every corner now reminded me of the lies, the deceit. I drove aimlessly for hours, through the city and out into the suburbs, my thoughts spiraling. Brad and Emily had both lied to my face. They had crossed a line, and then they had tried to cover it up. But was I overreacting? It wasn't like they had slept together. It was one kiss, one moment of weakness, Was it enough to throw away everything we had built together? But then again, if they could lie about that, what else were they capable of hiding? How could I ever trust Emily again when I knew she had been keeping something like this from me? And Brad, my best friend. How could I ever look him in the eye after this? I found myself parked outside a cheap motel on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the rundown building. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I checked in, barely registering the conversation with the clerk, and trudged to my room. The bed was lumpy, the walls thin, and the smell of stale cigarettes lingered in the air. But it was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like days, I was alone. As I lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about a kiss. It was about trust. Trust that had been broken, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. I had to make a decision. Either I was going to fight for our marriage or I was going to walk away. But how do you fight for something when the foundation is already cracked? Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind was a constant loop of questions and doubts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. Emily and Brad, laughing, talking, and then that kiss. It played over and over again in my head. A scene I hadn't witnessed but could vividly imagine. It was torture. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as confused and angry as before. I knew I couldn't stay holed up in that motel forever. I had to face Emily to confront this mess head-on. But I needed to clear my head first. I decided to go for a drive, hoping that the open road would give me some clarity. I drove out of town, past the familiar places, until I found myself on a deserted stretch of highway. The radio played softly in the background, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was too busy sorting through the wreckage of my marriage. As the miles passed, I started thinking about the good times, how Emily and I had met, the early days of our relationship, how we used to talk about everything. We had been so connected, so in sync. When had that started to change? Was it when Brad had entered the picture, or had it started long before that? I remembered the way Emily used to look at me, with a kind of love that felt almost overwhelming. Had that look faded, or had I just stopped noticing it? I thought about all the times she had tried to reach out to me in the past few months, times I had brushed off because I was too wrapped up in work or my own stress. Was I partly to blame for what had happened? I shook the thought from my head. No, this wasn't my fault. Emily had made a choice to keep things from me, to hide the truth. And Brad had made a choice too. They had both betrayed me, and I had every right to feel hurt and angry. But as much as I wanted to stay mad, there was still a part of me that wanted to fix things. I wasn't ready to throw it all away. Not yet. I pulled over at a rest stop and sat there, staring out at the empty highway. I had to talk to Emily again. Really talk. Not just accusations and denials, but an honest conversation. If there was any chance of saving our marriage, it had to start with the truth. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. It rang a few times before she picked up. Jessie. Her voice was soft, tentative. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady but firm. There was a long pause on the other end before she answered. Okay, I'm at home. I hung up and started the car, heading back toward town. This was it. Either we were going to find a way through this, or it was over. I didn't know which outcome scared me more. When I walked through the door of our house, Emily was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked up at me with eyes full of fear and hope, a fragile combination that mirrored my own emotions. I sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. We need to be honest with each other. Completely. She nodded, wiping away a stray tear. I agree. For the first time in what felt like forever, we talked. Really talked. She admitted to the kiss, to the emotional connection she had with Brad, and I admitted to my own failings in the relationship. It was painful and raw, but it was also the most real conversation we had had in months. By the end of it, we were both exhausted, but there was a sense of relief too. We had laid everything out on the table, and now we had a choice to make. Either we were going to rebuild our marriage from the ground up, or we were going to walk away. I want to make this work, Emily said softly, her eyes searching mine. But I need to know if you do too. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. I saw the person who had stood by me through thick and thin, the person I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with. "I want to try," I said, my voice full of uncertainty but also hope. "But it's going to take time." And that was the truth. We had a long road ahead of us, full of challenges and doubts. But for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could make it through. Together.